Thank you, Professor Flagelman, Mr. Gutierrez, and Ms. Pena. So for our next panel, here we go. Born and raised in Miami, Chris grew up at Dartmouth, where he dabbled in acting and directing. He then headed to Los Angeles to act, earned a living reading and reviewing scripts for 5 years. Chris then moved back to Miami, learned his trial skills in Miami law, joined an improv theater group, started playwriting while in law school. Chris went on to hone his trial skills at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, but kept writing. Fast forward to June 2016. American Son debuts at Barrington Stage Company's Boyd Quinson main stage in the Berkshires. Moved to late 2018. American Son is preparing to make its Broadway debut, starring Kerry Washington. Directed by Tony Award winner Kenny Leon. Oh, and Shonda Rhimes, Jada Pinkett Smith, and Gabrielle Union signed on as co-producers. January 27th, 2019, American Son concludes a successful run on Broadway. January 28th, the American Son Broadway cast starts a 3-day shoot in a Brooklyn soundstage. And on November 1st, 2019, American Son became the first Broadway play to debut on Netflix. Chris is currently writing a pilot for an FX miniseries. Chris Demos Brown on Broadway, Hollywood and the Law, A Writer's Perspective. Chris?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I thought since this was a CLE on entertainment and sports law, what might be helpful is for me to briefly just tell you a little bit about my experience as a client in unfamiliar industry. I have kind of the unusual benefit of having been both a lawyer and then kind of seeing what it's like to be, kind of like a doctor being wheeled into the emergency room. So I think that experience might be instructive. And then I'll tell you what I learned from this experience that I valued in my lawyers. So as Alex said, I had a play on Broadway about 1.5 years ago. And forgive me if this is a little bit of entertainment law 101, but let me give you a little bit of background about how Broadway contract works versus how a television or film contract works. Broadway is a very small world. A lot of the relationships are old and ossified. So much so, I learned to my surprise that the actual agreements to put a play into a theater, one of the Schubert theaters, one of the Niederlander theaters, one of the Janssen theaters, those are the 3 main property owners on Broadway. Those contracts are usually done on a handshake between the producer and the actual theater, which is rather remarkable given the millions of dollars that are at stake. The difference between a play, from my point of view as a writer, and a film or television show is that I own the play and I license it. So nobody, artistically, it's a huge advantage because nobody can change a word of what I've written without my permission. The disadvantage is the money you get paid for a play is typically less. It's a percentage of a formula called NAGBOR, which is an adjusted gross box office amount. The typical contract for a Broadway play is an almost incomprehensible 45-page behemoth that's sort of been around since the 1970s, and it's one that the Dramatists Guild and Broadway producers have agreed to use. As I say, I'm a lawyer. I'm primarily a litigator, but I do deal with contracts a lot in my work, and I found this one almost incomprehensible after reading it 10 times. In Hollywood, when you write a screenplay or film, typically you sell the copyright to it. So, for example, in my deal with FX to write a pilot for a miniseries, I am hired to write it, but once it's written, the producers of it can change anything they want, the settings, the characters, the words, anything. They can bring somebody else in to rewrite it. In exchange for that, I'm paid a fixed amount, which is generally much better than you make on a typical play. my play American Son presented a little bit of a challenge to the Netflix folks, because what they were doing is sort of attempting to see if they could take a non-musical play directly from Broadway, shoot it in a studio setting, and immediately ramp up content for it in a very short period of time. The problem it presented was basically they were shooting the play as written. Because of that, you can see that there's a tension. What did they own? And this became kind of a big contention of our contractual negotiations. I have an ongoing contractual obligation to the people that invested in the play to continue to exploit the rights of the play by letting the play get done in different theaters around the country and around the world. If I sold the rights to the play as written to Netflix, that would create a problem with the producers. So Netflix, which is used to saying, I buy it from you, I own it, therefore I can stream it as much as I want, because that's their model. I had to convince them that they could not own the rights to the play and limit my ability to produce it, to have stage productions get done. So that was sort of a bit of a challenge, and I think it was a new experience for Netflix. So let me hustle along a little quickly so I can leave time for some of your questions. Here are the 4 things I learned as a client in the entertainment industry, which I was not familiar with other than as a writer. The first thing I learned that I value in a lawyer, obviously, is I want a lawyer who knows the law, whatever law might be applied to my contract. But that's sort of the same way you expect an NFL receiver to be able to catch a pass that's in his hands over the middle. That's sort of the last thing, or the minimum you expect. So that's the minimum thing I want from my lawyer. The second thing that I learned is part of what an entertainment lawyer was bringing to the table for me is knowledge of the industry. I need to know, because I don't, where do I have leverage and where do I not have leverage as a writer? I need to know what kind of demands I will make that might make me look like an idiot. I don't want to be asking for things that are going to make people go, wow, this guy looks like he's never been here before. I need to know what things I should be asking for. So, for example, I was advised in the process of both of my contract with Netflix and my contract with FX that I should be asking for a travel budget and insisting upon certain requirements for travel. Otherwise, I would look like I hadn't been there before. In my world as a lawyer, not having a prevailing party fees clause is basically like not having a contract. That's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily something that I learned one should insist on, because that's not necessarily the industry standard. So that's the second thing I'm looking for, is a lawyer who knows the business and the people I'm dealing with. The third thing, frankly, that I'm looking for is a lawyer who's not there to simply cover his or her own posterior, but is there to give me frank advice. As a transactional lawyer, I'm putting on my lawyer hat, my instinct was always get everything I can for my client. There's a famous saying, I think by George Kennan, referring to the UN Security Council and its permanent members. And he said, you know, the fact that the 5 people are on the Security Council is a reflection of the power at the time. And contracts, I learned in this process as a client, are really a simple reflection of the parties' relative power to one another. So part of what I valued in the legal advice I got was a lawyer who could tell me, this is the leverage you have, and more important, this is when you have it. So for example, Netflix was in such a hurry to get American Son, my play, up and running, that we were literally still negotiating a contract as the shoot was starting. So I had a lot of leverage at that moment because they really wanted to start shooting. The minute I signed the contract, I lost all leverage, and that was something that was helpful for me to know. And the last thing, and this is very important, I think, in your world in particular, which I hadn't realized because I'd never dealt with it before, is I think you need to understand that very often, whether you're dealing with, you know, a gymnast or a musician or a writer or an actress, this is not a contract for construction of a property development or the sale of an aircraft engine or a partnership. You're dealing often with someone's dream. And so when you know, I was a 50-year-old guy when I got a play on Broadway. So I had some life experience, but it was still, for me, I would have paid the people on Broadway to put my show on Broadway. I needed guidance from somebody who understood that you have a client who's dealing with what might be the most exciting moment of his or her life. And that's very different from dealing with somebody who's, you know, just maybe, you know, doing another contract to buy a good or set up a business. So those are the things I learned as a client, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few questions from our attendees. The one that's gotten the most likes so far is this one. Chris, how do you balance your career as an attorney with your career as a writer and a creative? What advice do you have for others seeking to do the same?
Well, writing is, and writing plays in particular, are a very, very, they leave you a lot of time because you can do it whenever you want. Plays, unlike novels, don't require the same number of just sheer hours in the box to do it. I joined a small firm with my wife about 7 years ago, so I have a lot of flexibility as to when I write and when I practice law. That helps a lot. And I don't really have any other hobbies. I don't golf. I don't do anything other than travel with my family much. So this is my hobby and my second career. So that those two things, I'd say, having a boss that's my wife that cuts me a lot of slack helps. Being in a creative field that allows you some flexibility. It would be impossible to be an actor and a lawyer, I think, because you don't get to set your own hours. Also having sort of directed and focused attention on that particular art as opposed to doing lots.
Thank you. Here's another one. In your experience, how do agents and lawyers interact when representing a client?
That's a great question because it's one I still am not 100% sure about, and it differs from place to place. So in theater, my agent, this sounds crazy. My agent had a lawyer who would look over my contract. The same lawyer was representing the producer who was negotiating the contract. So I still found that to be a crazy conflict of interest. But in the theater world, it didn't matter much because everybody was, you were either going to take, I was either going to take the contract or I was not going to take the contract. There was not much negotiating to be done. In the theater world, an agent understands the deal and sets up the deal. The lawyer is really there to deal with legal issues. Negotiating the specific issues in the contract that we're, you know, all used to from Contracts 101. The lawyer is the person who kind of comes in, at least from my experience, comes in at the end and makes sure that you're turning the terms of the deal into legally enforceable provisions.
One more question, I think it's all we have time for right now. But this one's gotten a lot of likes from our audience. In regards to having a lawyer who knows the industry, how do you suggest young lawyers who are still learning the industry or breaking into the industry obtain clients?
It depends. So two things. My assumption is if you want to be a sports lawyer, you love sports. If you want to be a lawyer in the entertainment industry, you probably love films or TV or whatever, or music, whatever it is that you're interested in practicing, whatever field you're interested in practicing in. So if, for example, you're interested in theater, I would, being a lawyer in that field, I would go to a lot of plays. attend a lot of events within that specific field, industry events. I think I can speak only for writers. We don't really know where to look for lawyers. So when I was looking for an entertainment lawyer to help me negotiate my television contracts, I went to other people who are lawyers and said, "Do you know somebody?" So developing your network within your cadre of lawyers is probably the most important place to go, and letting people know this is what I do. So if you happen to know a guy who's a 17-year-old prodigy on the football field and he's looking for an entertainment sports lawyer, let him know I'm your guy. So those would be my two main suggestions. Look for industry events you can attend and go to, and develop your lawyer referral network.
Thank you. We actually have time for one more question, if that's all right. Marissa asks, how does your theater experience aid your abilities as a lawyer and vice versa?
I've found that obviously theater is great training for courtroom work because the two go together really well. I've actually found that being a lawyer has helped me more as a playwright than vice versa. Being a lawyer, and I tell people this who are vacillating on whether to go to law school. A couple of the great things about being a lawyer are that you get the discipline of attacking and examining problems very carefully. The skill of issue spotting translates well into almost any other endeavor, but particularly in writing for stage and screen, because a lot of the process of writing is about being able to dramatize issues. And if you are good at issue spotting, that tends to be a creative process, and it's one that translates well, I think, into theater. So not to turn your question on its head, but I actually find being a lawyer helps more in my writing endeavors and vice versa.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
Anytime, thanks.
There will now be a 10-minute break, followed by our next panel, IP protection for graffiti art, beginning at 10:10 a.m. See you guys soon.